Are you worried about osteoporosis or osteopenia? If you hear this, you might not be so worried. Hi, I'm GloryB, and this is GloryB-TV, a lifestyle channel for mature women who want to look fabulous, feel amazing, and age gracefully. When I was 60, I was diagnosed with osteoporosis in one part of my spine. I refused to take the pharmaceutical drugs and focused on a natural approach through diet, supplements, and exercise. The osteoporosis reversed by the time I was 61. Now I'm 64. There are many other factors that can lead to weakened bones, such as loads of stress in your life, things you're eating and drinking, and common protozoas. And I've covered several of these topics on other videos. But what about osteoporosis itself, as well as the machines that measure it? Who decided how osteoporosis would be defined, and likewise how osteopenia would be defined? And then who decided what the treatment would be for osteoporosis or osteopenia? My questions are a type of pun, and the clue is built into my questions. It might surprise you and perhaps even anger you to find out the answers to my questions, so let's dive right in. I'm going to use an article which tells the story. Now, this story is told on a handful of publications and websites. I found one of them a week ago, and it was written by the British author, but I found it on a Facebook post on my phone. I read half of it, and when I came back to it on the phone, Facebook had moved that article out of the way completely, and it wasn't even in a browser. That'll teach me not to read good articles from Facebook on my phone. It's too bad, too, as that article contained a bit of British sarcasm, which I enjoy. If I find it again, I'll link it in the video's description box and in the first comment. But I do have another article from NPR, which goes over most of the same stories and points. So let's start there. This article I'll also link in the description box and in the first comment. It's titled, How a Bone Disease Grew to Fit the Prescription by Alex Spiegel, and it's dated a while back, December 21st, 2009, an oldie but a goodie. So let's read it together. Most of it anyway. Katie Banghauser had no concept of all the forces that combined to bring the box of pills to the bottom shelf of her medicine cabinet. All she knew was that 3 years ago she went in for a routine checkup and her doctor told her it was time for her to take a test. Not that there was anything in particular about Banghauser that suggested sickness. At 54, she exercised every day and could outrun most 20-year-olds. She was a model of health. Still, because Banghauser was thin, white, female, and in her 50s and had a sister who had some bone problems, she says her doctor told her that she was concerned. She felt like because my frame is slight and I'm female that I was at risk for developing osteoporosis. Now, the next paragraph. Look. This is NPR. Osteoporosis is a disease. So, let me just say this. Okay, osteoporosis is a disease. And here's where the NPR article differs from the British article I'm still trying to find. Here, NPR refers to osteoporosis as a disease, but I don't think the other article did that. And as we read on, we'll see why NPR called it a disease is quite a misnomer. Okay, so to define osteoporosis, it affects mostly elderly women, but it says, just to make sure, Banghauser went in for a test that measured the density of her bones. 2 weeks later, a letter came in the mail with an unsettling message. Banghauser had a condition called osteopenia, and her doctor recommended medication. Then they don't go over this wonderful chart that's here, but this kind of sets the tone for the rest of the article. The next section is called Osteopenia versus Osteoporosis. I'm not going to read that because it's more important what comes later. So let's go to the section called A Biography of a Medication. This is a story of how pills for osteopenia ended up in Banghauser's medicine cabinet, but in the medicine cabinets of millions of women like her all over the United States. Remember, we're not talking about osteoporosis. We're talking about osteopenia. Okay, not even osteoporosis. So it says, but more broadly is a story of how the definition of what constitutes a disease evolves and the role that drug companies can play in that evolution. Okay, osteopenia is a condition that only recently started to be thought of as a problem that required treatment. Until the early 90s, only a handful of people had even heard the word. To understand how osteopenia was transformed from a rarely heard word into a problem that millions of women swallow pills to treat, you need to go back to the beginning, to a place very far away from Ms. Banghauser's suburban Virginia home. So this section, a meeting, a decision, a disease, I want you to hear this. The meeting took place in Rome, in a small hotel at the top of the Spanish Steps. There, in 1992, a group of osteoporosis experts gathered under the auspices of the World Health Organization. Who? That's the clue to the questions I asked earlier. I said, who defined osteoporosis? Who defined osteopenia? Haha, we're getting there. The meeting had been organized because professional opinion about how to diagnose and measure osteoporosis was all over the map. Doctors and researchers didn't even have a shared view of how osteoporosis should be defined. For a long time, doctors and researchers were only able to diagnose osteoporosis after a woman experienced a bone fracture. By the early 90s, technology evolved, bone scatterings made it possible, blah, blah, blah. So, the questions before the experts in Rome was this. Since after the age of 30, you got that 30, all bones lose density, how much bone loss was normal? And how much put women at risk and therefore should be considered a disease? Gets even better. Anna Tosteson is a professor of medicine at Dartmouth who attended the meeting. She says over a 2 or 3 day period, the experts in the room went back and forth, looking at research and trying to decide precisely where on a graph of diminishing bone density to draw a line. Ultimately, it was just a matter of, well, it has to be drawn somewhere, Tosteson said, and as I recall, it was very hot in the meeting room, and people were in shirt sleeves, and it was time to kind of move on, if you will. And I can't quite frankly remember who it was who stood up and drew the picture and said, well, let's just do this. So there in the hotel room, someone literally stood up, took a marker, obviously, and drew a line through the graph, a vertical line depicting diminishing bone density, and decreed every woman on one side of the line has a disease. Then a new question arose. How do you categorize the women who are just on the other side of the line? To address this issue, Tosteson says the experts, more or less off the cuff, decided to use the term osteopenia. Tosteson says they created the category mostly because they thought it might be useful for public health researchers who like clear categories for their studies. They never imagined, she says, that people would come to think of osteopenia as a disease in itself to be treated. The chairman of the meeting, John Canis of the WHO Collaborating Center for Metabolic Bone Diseases, says the same thing. They made it up, people. They made it all up. Nevertheless, 17 years later, Banghauser, a woman whose bone density is just a hair away from that of an average healthy 30-year-old, is not only medicated for osteopenia, but literally spends her days worried about breaking a bone. Well, if she's been taking this med for 17 years, maybe she should be worried about breaking a bone. She says she used to run marathons, she'd fall, she'd trip, and back before this diagnosis, she didn't think anything about it. And of course, she didn't break a bone. But now every time she falls, she thinks, oh good, I didn't break a bone. Oh my gosh, it's just, they put all this fear in this woman. It's just terrible. So how did osteopenia change from a category for public health researchers into a condition that millions of women swallow pills to treat? The answer to that question starts with a man named Jeremy Allen, who lives in a sprawling home in Pennsylvania. I'm sure he does. So this section is called The Man Who Measured Bones. So Jeremy Allen was born in the UK, came to the US in 82, young man with energy to spare, blah, blah, blah. Worked for all these different drug companies, and then he set up a consulting business in 1991. So in 1995, Mr. Allen was approached by the drug company Merck. Merck had just released a new drug called Fosamax, which Allen says represented a sea change in osteoporosis treatment. And he says Fosamax was the first non-hormonal drug that could credibly make a claim to stop the progress of osteoporosis. So until drugs like Fosamax began to emerge, standard treatments were calcium, vitamin D, weight-bearing exercise, hormonal treatments. He says, though ultimately hormonal treatments proved problematic. Now as I'm doing this, it's 2024, and I've read accounts of women taking some kind of hormonal treatments, and it's working well for them. So anyway, next paragraph. And it starts out NPR. Since osteoporosis is a serious problem, and I wrote in my notes, well, that's subjective. I think heart disease is a much more serious problem. I think cancer is a more serious problem. I think all these other comorbidities are a much more serious problem that people are much more likely to die of. But they think it affects millions of women. The potential market for Fosamax was enormous. Fosamax could become a blockbuster drug, one that made over $1 billion a year. The problem, Alan says, was that after Fosamax's release, Merck wasn't selling much of its drug. Aw, boo. So Alan had known the president of Merck. They'd worked together before, and the president of Merck told him, figure out how to fix this. Okay, so he set to work. He talked to researchers, doctors, and soon the issue with Fosamax sales became clear. To get large numbers of women on Fosamax, large numbers of women needed to get their bones scanned and be diagnosed with osteoporosis. But in America in 1995, there was simply no way to do that. He said the machines measuring bone density were rare. And back then, he said they were costing $200, $250, or $300 per test. Well, I'll tell you, the very first time I had a DEXA scan, it was $265, and that went on my insurance. But anyway, there were only a couple hundred testing centers in the U.S., so this is what he did to sell Fosamax. Merck and Mr. Allen needed to do two things. They needed to place machines that can measure bone density in doctor's office all across America, and they need to bring down the price. But Allen says for him, that just wasn't a matter of selling drugs. He considered osteoporosis to be a public health crisis. Oh, I just read the drama in there. He points out that 1 in 5 elderly women with a hip fracture dies within a year. But that doesn't mean 1 in 5 elderly women have a hip fracture, okay? It's just, more elderly men and women are dying of heart disease, cancer, high blood pressure, strokes, and stuff like that. Okay. So he came out with this conviction he was about to do good. And here we go from Mr. Allen. So to do this, he figured he needed an institution. So he started this nonprofit called the Bone Measurement Institute. He was the only employee. There's no payroll or anything. It was just him. Probably to start a nonprofit in most states, you need to have 3 people on the board of directors, but it was like no biggie. But now they had their institute. So he wanted to look for an alternative to the standard way that bones are measured in America. Okay, now we're in the section called Boosting Bone Scan Machine Sales. But remember, they only had the real expensive machines. So in 1995, that's where bone machines were, bone scanning machines. And who knows how good they were. But anyway, he needed something smaller, cheaper. So he figured they could come up with something called peripheral machines, small portable units that would measure bone density in the forearm, heel, wrist, or finger rather than the hip and spine. At the time, few bone measurement companies manufactured because they didn't measure the hip and spine. So, from his perspective, this was a perfect solution. These smaller machines wouldn't take much office space. They cost a fraction of the big machines, which meant doctors should be able to afford them. But I wrote in my notes, that's a one-sided opinion. Is well, fine. So Allen started a campaign to ensure that peripheral machines were both manufactured and then promoted. So he and his Merck team went to 6 or 7 of the top manufacturers of companies that were in the bone scanning business or wanted to get in the business and said, we, Merck, will fund your development of these other smaller machines. But according to Mr. Allen, several of the machine manufacturers were less than enthusiastic. In fact, Mr. Allen says 2 of the dominant players were downright hostile. And this is what he said. Because it wasn't as profitable, I was a threat to their business model. Their business model was to sell just a few machines at a very, very high price. I wanted them to sell a lot of machines at a much lower price. Now, we'll see this is not necessarily true. That's a twisting of the truth. Okay, now we go to Mr. Richard Mazes. I think it's Mazes, founder of Lunar Corporation, one of the largest manufacturers of bone density machines. He had a different view of Mr. Allen's attempt to promote the peripheral machines. So Mazes says Lunar Company's resistance to embracing the peripheral machines had nothing to do with money or business models. Lunar opposed the peripherals on the merits. He says it was diametrically opposed to what the academics thought was best for diagnosis and would just lead to bad medicine. Okay, because they're not measuring the hip or spine. The problem with the smaller peripheral machines is that taking a measurement of someone's heel or forearm isn't going to tell you what you need to know about the bones, and the parts of the body that are fractured increase a woman's risk of death, the hip and spine. So Mr. Mazes says, we are not about to go ahead and tell physicians to use inadequate diagnostic equipment simply because Merck wanted us to. And he said because Lunar Corp refused to cooperate, his company was threatened. He says Merck told him the following: you're not going to get support from Merck, and we will support your competitors, and we will tell people working with Merck not to use Lunar machines. So basically, Mr. Mazes says Merck was going to make sure that we paid the price. So Lunar wasn't the only company put on notice that Merck was serious about investing in the smaller peripheral machines to drive down the price. Mr. Allen says that to encourage companies to take Merck's goals seriously, Merck purchased a bone measurement business. So he says Merck bought one of the companies, showed how low the price could become, purely to get everybody's attention. We got everybody's attention, Mr. Allen says. And then subsequently, when everyone else moved, which he means moved to manufacture these smaller machines, we let it go and the company closed. We cheered its demise. Great. Okay, so then we have Merck's perspective. Paul Strain is a lawyer who represents Merck's corporate office. He wasn't able to comment on the particular Mr. Allen's story, but he did say Merck set up a nonprofit called the Bone Measurement Institute. From Merck's perspective, helping to foster and develop diagnostic tests is simply part of the process of putting out many drugs. So, you create a drug, then you create a process that screens for that illness that that drug is supposed to. You get it. Of course, they want everyone to believe that Fosamax is a drug with genuine life-saving potential. Okay, so he says Merck had an effective medicine. It was the first effective non-hormonal medicine for dealing with osteoporosis, and physicians were interested in it. But there were significant barriers to doctors getting these machines because they were expensive. So the attorney rejects the idea that the peripheral machines were inferior. He thinks that a scan of the wrist or forearm doesn't provide good information about the risk of hip and spine fracture, and he thinks it's fine. But others disagree. So here's somebody who disagrees with him. Sanford Bain, former president of the International Society of Clinical Densitometry, argues that peripheral machines should only rarely be used to diagnose osteoporosis. During menopause, bone is lost at different rates at different sites in the skeleton. So the way to best predict hip and spine fracture is to measure the hip and spine directly. The risk of hip and spine fracture are more reliably estimated by the central machines rather than the peripheral smaller machines. Nevertheless, Merck did work hard to get the smaller machines into doctors' offices, which of course by now we know they can send us all the time for regular DEXA machines. I've had these with the little machines where you sign up for some screening. It's like more heart kind of screening, but they'll do the bone density one too. But that doesn't mean that we're good with DEXA. Okay, so Allen says Merck helped get peripherals through the FDA process by funding trials and assisting with submissions. So anyway, they got their little machines. So now we go into the section called a tipping point for osteopenia. And So Merck's work didn't stop there, of course. They wanted their little small machines out. Oh, then they got Medicare to reimburse for the cost of the bone scans. And that was really important because so many older women are the people who want to get scanned or got scared by this. But we get into the middle of the page here. In the late 90s and into the early 2000s, measuring bone density became a profitable thing to do. Okay, turns a profit. And so that's why anybody involved in it would, their ears perk up at profit. Something else critical to the story happened in 97. Cummings points out that was also the year Merck got clearance from the FDA for a new version of Fosamax. So Merck developed a dose of Fosamax. It was a 5 milligram dose. That's a lower dose. And this was intended for women with osteopenia. Okay, it wasn't enough that they were going to get all this market share of women diagnosed with osteoporosis. Okay. Steve Cummings was the director of clinical research at California Pacific Medical Center Research. So he said, to understand how so many women today are treated for osteopenia, look more closely at all the machines, large machines and small machines that Merck helped place in doctors' offices. He says, I think the critical event in turning osteopenia into a condition that people believe needs treatment is the report that comes from the bone density machines. Just to scare the heck out of you. So it talks a little bit about what these reports show you. And then the next paragraph I'm going to show you is another quote from Mr. Cummings. When millions of women are getting the word osteopenia from the bone density test report that they are getting in their 50s and 60s, they get worried. When a clinician sees the word osteopenia on a report, they think it's a disease. They want to know, what should I do? Additionally, I love this, Merck and even other companies, they started running commercials advertising drugs to prevent osteoporosis. Those commercials don't feature humped over grannies, but young-looking women. And Cummings says at a certain stage, it simply reaches a tipping point. Okay? So bone densitometry, bone tests become increasingly available. Women start wanting it. They hear their friends have had a measurement of bone density. Their friend was told they have osteopenia, and they want to know if they have that condition. And then their friend starts getting treated with Fosamax or some other drug, and they want to know if they should be treated. It's almost viral. Okay, Medicare claims for screening exams increased from 77,000 in 1994 to more than 1.5 million annually by 1999. That's just in 5 years. Okay. The sale of the peripheral machines went up more than 500% in that same time period. And through this process of testing and advertising, eventually a cultural consensus took hold. Osteopenia simply became a condition that was seriously considered for treatment, for drug treatment. A diagnosis was born. Now, here's the potential problems with treating osteopenia. For many people, particularly Mr. Allen, what's described above is all for the good. No one is lost. Everyone is one. Okay, what I want you to do when you have some time is go online and use Google or DuckDuckGo or whatever you use and look up Fosamax lawsuits. Fosamax lawsuits. Now, you're going to find a lot of old lawsuits. You're going to find some lawsuits were dismissed because some people in a class action, they were suing Fosamax because Fosamax didn't warn them on any kind of packaging or an insert about what could really happen, the bad side effects like breaking a bone. And then Fosamax came back and showed proof, or Merck did, that Merck had actually told the FDA, you know, in our trials, we've seen these side effects. We want to put that in the packaging. And what I read online, it said the FDA told him you can't put that in there. You can't make this stuff up. So go look and see what's going on with lawsuits and what's gone on in the past and what kinds of things are people suing for, and also look up Fosamax side effects. Or for any drug that comes out. There could be new drugs that are going to come out 6 months after you see this video. So, look it up with lawsuits or look it up with the word side effects to see what they have. So, of course, he thinks it's a really successful drug. He said a lot less women are dying of hip fractures or stooped over than there were a generation ago. And then the writer of the article says, well, maybe. There's scientific consensus that it's beneficial to give Fosamax to women with osteoporosis, especially older women and any woman who's already had a fracture. Of course, I still wouldn't take it, but that's me. The lawyer said Fosamax is also good for women with osteopenia. Well, of course, it's good for business. He says Fosamax and drugs like it build bones and therefore prevent fractures in women with osteopenia. Well, I'm preventing fractures in women in me. I don't have to take a drug for it. I don't think he says it's well established that there's a clear correlation between bone mineral density and fracture risk. By taking Fosamax, though, bone scientists like Cummings say Fosamax and drugs like it are not necessarily a win for women with osteopenia. Okay. Then we go into studies with women with osteopenia show that while Fosamax and similar drugs reduce spinal fractures, I'd really like to know why or see what else is going on. The drugs may not reduce other types of bone fractures that are more common in women who have osteopenia. So Susan Ott is Associate Professor, Department of Medicine, University of Washington. She said there's no difference in the number of non-spine fractures you had whether you took the medicine or a placebo. It does make your bone density go up higher, but the number of fractures is what really matters, and that didn't really change. So here's what the other thing that the NPR person isn't talking about. And this goes back to what Dr. Shostak said in the very first video we did together, the very first one, okay? And she said, when you take these drugs, it puts onto your bones something that they call cheap bone. It's not really strong bone like you can get from exercise and eating better and getting rid of stuff out of your life that are causing osteoporosis or bone loss, okay? So if it puts cheap bone on, you don't know that from the DEXA scan because the DEXA scan can't tell the difference between good bone and cheap bone. So your DEXA always looks better. So even though we talked about that on that video and I mentioned a couple others, I'll still get comments from women saying, oh, well, I took such and such drug and my DEXA scan got so much better. Were you not listening? It's cheap bone, okay? It's not good, strong, normal. The cells God gave you, good bone. It's cheap bone. And that's why we find women who take these bone drugs often break their bones, okay? Do a little research because you'll find that out. You'll see that I'm telling you the truth, okay? And then it says, what about long-term? There are no long-term studies that look at what happens to women with osteopenia who start taking Fosamax in their 50s and continue treatment long-term in the hopes of preventing old age fractures, and none are planned. So Cummings says treatment should only start when fracture risk is significant, when bone density is really low, or someone already has a spine fracture. Okay, then he talks about some things with the WHO, a new tool, blah, blah, blah. You know what? We're still in the same place as we were when this was written in 2009. So then we go on to the section called the paradox of our healthcare system. So there's still controversy among specialists about when women with osteopenia should get this medication. But what isn't clear now is that getting that box of pills into Ms. Banghauer's medicine cabinet wasn't a simple matter. Alan says it took a huge amount of work he loved, blah, blah, blah. He's really happy with his work. Okay, so then we get to Mr. Mazes from the Lunar Company, who doesn't see it that way. Mr. Mazes says Jeremy Allen was complicit in a plot to misdiagnose American women. Mazes said this. I didn't. Now, from Mr. Mazes' perspective, millions of women with osteopenia are now needlessly exposed to the risk of a medication that may not ultimately help them. The paradox of our healthcare system is that both these men are probably right. That is, drug companies produce incredible drugs that can relieve suffering. But one way they profit from those drugs is to extend their use to as many people as possible, which frequently means that medications are used in populations with milder and milder versions of a disease so that the risks of medicating can come to outweigh the benefits. So those are the origins of the definition of what osteoporosis is, the definition of what osteopenia is, and how all types of bone density machines came into being. They needed to sell a lot of Fosamax, and to do that, to get a lot of women taking Fosamax, they needed to get millions of women convinced to get a bone scan, which would tell them they had osteopenia or osteoporosis according to the subjective definitions concocted in a hot hotel meeting room in Spain in 1992. Most of you are going to be able to use natural means to keep your bones strong and to not break a bone even if you fall. Besides bone building exercises, I also do several balancing exercises designed to keep me from falling. Some of you have more complicated issues going on in your bodies, and doing what I've done with diet, supplements, and exercise aren't working well to give you stronger bones, even though that means we're trusting the results of the current bone density machines, the DEXA scans. Still, many of my viewers have chosen to work with Dr. Denise Shostak to get to the root of why you have osteoporosis or osteopenia, and then to put actions in place to reverse it. We discuss what it's like to work with Dr. Shostak and what it costs in this video that I'll link in the description box and in a card. She develops a custom plan for you based on your blood work and any other tests that are needed, and by Q&A with you as you work with her directly. Now, at the time of that video, she was charging $289 for the telemedicine program. Or for another person who works with you directly for osteoporosis, you can always work with this guy who now charges $12,799 for a year. I don't know about you, but I'd rather pay $289. Make sure you check out Dr. Shostak. Links are in the description box and first comment. I have lots of other videos for you to check out, and I have all of my osteoporosis related videos on one playlist. I'll have that link for you so that you can focus on what I've done to reverse osteoporosis and to create real strong bones. Or tap one of the images on the right side of your screen, and I'll see you in the next video.